Appreciate the lessons Herbert W. Armstrong learned at the start of the Philadelphia era. Next, on The Key of David with Gerald Flurry.
And now I'd like to have all of the others that at least would consider themselves in the Eugene Church, which is the parent church of the Philadelphia era. Would you please stand? I think there should most of them be in one area. I'm not sure they were seated that way. Oh, how we have grown through the years. You know, since this original church here at Eugene 50 years ago, this church grew at the rate of 30% every year for 35 years.
That is 20th century educator and theologian Herbert W. Armstrong talking in 1983. It was the 50th year anniversary of the birthplace of the Philadelphia era of God's true church. And he was looking back on the small beginnings of the church, and it was right here in Eugene, Oregon, that everything got started for the Philadelphia era. As I say, he was speaking in 1983, 50 years on, looking back. Of course, Herbert Armstrong died in 1986. So we're now many years ahead, almost a century, going back to 1933, a century away from the birthplace of the Philadelphia era. I'd like to draw your attention to the literature that we're going to spotlight today, The True History of God's True Church, written by my father. And that, of course, gives you the sweep, the grand sweep of church history going all the way back to its establishment by Jesus Christ and the early apostles there in the book of Acts. So if you don't have that book in your library, make sure that you call our operators today and request your free copy. I just want to play one more clip from that anniversary sermon that Herbert Armstrong gave back in 1983.
Well, now today we're celebrating not only the 50th anniversary of the local Eugene Church, as it was, which was the first church of the Philadelphia era. I was still working with and preaching in the Sardis churches up in the Willamette Valley, up near Jefferson, and over in the little country schoolhouse of Deaver, up in that direction. But God began to reveal new truth that the others didn't know, and I found that those people who were humble and sincere people, and they had God's Sabbath, they had the truth of God's law, they had the right name, the Church of God, they were a sincere people. But they felt they had all of the knowledge, and they would not accept any new knowledge that the Bible contained that they hadn't seen. And so they didn't grow with us.
So these people who are actually from the Sardis era of God's church, the fifth era of the true church, they rejected new truth, new revelation, and eventually they rejected Herbert W. Armstrong. And so Mr. Armstrong was left basically to go it alone. And as I say, these are where those early campaigns started. This is from his autobiography. It says, "If men pay us a salary," at the time he was working for the Oregon Conference on a small salary of $3 per week and conducting some campaigns with Sardis ministers, and there just wasn't much fruit that ever came from that. And he says, even as small as $3 per week, we have now learned we must preach only what men order us to preach. So there was this big dispute. I won't get into all the details, but the Oregon Conference basically said to Mr. Armstrong, you have to speak, or teach this doctrine this way. And he said, well, it's not biblical. So it led to this dispute, this division, and Mr. Armstrong finally said, you know what, we're going to reject that $3 salary. He discussed it with his wife and just rely solely on God. That all happened, as I say, in, I think it was the early fall or late summer of 1933. It says in the autobiography, God had prepared us for relying solely on Him by many miraculous answers to prayer. Therefore, we knew in perfect faith that God would supply our need. And anyone familiar with the work of Herbert Armstrong will remember that, his TV program was one of the most popular, it was the most popular program in the 1980s. And then his Plain Truth magazine went to 8 million people or households worldwide. And in both of those, whether it's the World Tomorrow program or the Plain Truth, he never asked for money. He just gave away God's truth for free. And he trusted God that God would provide, and God certainly did do that. But when he writes about this crucial period in 1933, he says it was a turning point for the work of God, for God's church. This was the crossroads, the final pivotal, crucial test before the living Christ began opening the doors of mass communication through which God's work at last could come to life after centuries of sleeping and go forth in mighty power to all the world, preparing the way before Christ's return to earth as ruler over all nations. The Church of God sprung to life at that time, 1933. If you look at the previous era of God's church, again, the Sardis era, Revelation 3 describes it as being dead. There was no life there. As I say, they rejected revelation. They rejected God's end-time Elijah. And yet here is where the birthplace is for the Philadelphia era of God's church. Mr. Armstrong used to walk this road. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. You've got the Fear Butte School that used to be right over here to my left that he conducted campaigns in. He had his first congregation was in that school, as well as the Eugene School, which was about 4 miles further on from here. And it's incredible history. This is where it started small. It was a mustard seed beginning, but what a crucial test it was for him to just break away entirely from being associated with the Oregon Conference and just going it alone with God, just trying to please God alone. Let's go to Revelation 3. He mentions open doors, and God started to open doors early on even. Those that are familiar with his work know that it became this epic worldwide work by the mid-1980s. But it was early on that those doors began to swing open. Notice what it says about the Philadelphia era of God's church. Well, let me just back up and read one more quote. It says, "I did not fully realize then that this was a crucial turning point in the history of the Church of God. What actually was happening, though we did not understand it then, was that a new era was dawning in the history of the Church of God. The church was transitioning into a new era, the Philadelphia era. And God says about that era in Revelation 3, verse 7, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things saith he that is holy, he that is true, he that has the key of David, he that opens, and no man shuts, and shuts, and no man opens." It says in verse 8, "I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, and no man can shut it. For you have a little strength, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name," or my authority, my government. Herbert Armstrong kept God's word. He observed the commandments of God. He submitted to the authority of God. And because he did that, because he relied solely on God, God just opened spectacular doors for him and for the work. My father says in his booklet, The Key of David, an open door is always synonymous with the preaching of a message. God opens the doors so that we can get the message of God out to this world. And yet, if God's doing it through human beings, it's always going to start very small, a mustard seed beginning. And Mr. Armstrong writes about that in the autobiography. It says in the autobiography, "Conversion in 1927 had deflated ego and replaced self-assurance with confidence, that is, faith in God." It says, "And this crisis," talking about the one in 1933, was the turning point when my wife and I actually, in practice, began relying solely on God, no longer on either self or men. If you know about his conversion, I won't get off track here too much, but he had a lot of self-confidence. He trusted in himself. And when he was converted to the truth, God showed him how to put his trust, his confidence in God. And then again, you come to, that was in 1926 and 1927, his conversion to the truth when he was baptized. But then you fast forward a few years to 1933 and think about the valuable lessons he's learning to just put total trust in God, to put total trust in God providing for the work. I mean, this is what made Herbert Armstrong and his ministry and the work of God so utterly unique. There was no other work like it in the 20th century. And of course, we've worked very hard in the Philadelphia Church of God to follow in his steps, to raise up the ruins, as it says in Amos 9, to continue on this same model, just putting our trust, our reliance on God alone. I mentioned the pathway here. In 1933, when he had these evangelistic campaigns here in this area, he stayed at the Fisher Farm, which is about 3 or 4 miles in that direction. And he had a campaign over here to my left, just a few hundred yards off, at the Fear Butte School, which is no longer in existence. And then the Gene Schoolhouse, 4 miles on from here, and there's just part of that left in existence. But anyway, one day he's on his way to one of these campaigns, these Bible campaigns, and there's a guy that accosts him, as he says in the autobiography, and basically says, "You're not going to get very far, Mr. Armstrong. You're not going to get very far. You won't get far," he said. "You're preaching the straight truth of the Bible." Imagine that. A guy saying you're not going to do very well because you're relying too much on the Bible. You're just giving the straight truth from the Bible. That offends people, he said. The Bible's like a sharp two-edged sword. It cuts, it reproves, corrects, rebukes. People won't support that kind of preaching. You won't get far. That exchange happened here in 1933, right here on this pathway. 1933. And I don't know what that individual's name is, but where did he end up? Because when you look at what happened to Mr. Armstrong's life, his ministry, and where he ended up in 1986 before he died, just incredible, awesome fruit all over the place. Jesus said to judge by fruits. Mr. Armstrong wrote, "But I was not relying on the support of people. If people paid me, I would have to serve people. If I were to serve God, I would have to look solely to God for support." And then he says this, of course, God does work through human instruments, but I had to rely on God to lay it on the hearts of people to support the kind of preaching that obeys Isaiah 58 and verse 1, that supports the kind of preaching that obeys that verse in Isaiah 58. What does that verse say? Well, I'll read it to you. It says, "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins." You've got to cry aloud. You've got to spare not. You've got to be courageous and bold. And you've got to show my people their sins, their transgressions. And Mr. Armstrong had the courage to do that. He came with that message. And it was motivated by love, God's love. Look, get out there and warn the nations. Warn them of what? Well, you get back to cause and effect. You get back to the book of Deuteronomy, what it says about blessings and cursings, that you're going to be blessed for obedience and cursed for disobedience. And so Mr. Armstrong was out there sounding the alarm, saying, look, curses are going to set in, even though this country's been fabulously blessed for centuries. You look at it today, I mean, you compare even the United States in 1933 to what it's like today, even in this region, and there's a lot of curses that are setting in. What would he say today, Mr. Armstrong, if he were here broadcasting, if he were on the television today? He would be obeying the command in Isaiah 58 and verse 1. He'd be talking about God's law. He'd be talking about the consequences of sin. He'd be talking about cause and effect. 1 John 3 and verse 4, this is New Testament. God says, "For sin is the transgression of the law." The transgression of God's law, that's what sin is. It transgresses God's holy, perfect, righteous law. And so you've got to get out there and proclaim that warning. This is what our sins, it's doing to us. So there's a call for repentance built into the message of God, the truth of God, the gospel of God. Matthew 24:14 talks about proclaiming the gospel as a witness. Think about that word for a moment. Why as a witness? Well, because most people are not going to respond to the warning. But God says, look, just obey Isaiah 58 and verse 1 anyway. And then I'll make sure that enough people come along to support the work. And Mr. Armstrong, he's often said that the principal reason that there were as many members of the Worldwide Church of God as there were in the mid-1980s was because of the needs of the work. People coming along as co-workers to begin with, and then as members later, and then pouring their hearts into the work, into supporting God's work. Just coming back to this verse in Isaiah 58 and verse 1, this is what my father says about it in his booklet on Isaiah. He says, the primary work of God's church is to proclaim Israel's sins. We are to show the house of Jacob its sins. It says, when God says to show my people their transgression, he's speaking first of all to the church of God. He says further on, all we're doing, for those critics that complain or criticize the work of God's church, well, it's too negative, it's too harsh. My father says all we're doing is obeying the command in Isaiah 58 and verse 1. If you look at the false prophets of today, and there are many, they oppose God's law. They fight against God's law. They don't obey the command in Isaiah 58 and verse 1. They preach, as the Bible says they would, smooth things. Read the end of 2 Timothy 4, or read what that entire chapter says about there's coming a time when people are going to turn away from the truth and instead embrace fables, false narratives, fakery, phoniness. There's plenty of that, even in religion. God says, obey the command. Look at how people just reject defiantly in some cases the truth of the Bible. As soon as you bring up the Bible, they just automatically reject it. It's not for our time, so many reason. Or if they do go to church, you know, it's a feel-good gospel. Everything's fine. Everything's getting better. It's not getting better. The morality is getting much worse. And if you're observing or watching world events like Jesus said that we should, then you see this, and you ought to be disturbed by it. It ought to be alarming. It should be. Notice what Isaiah the prophet said in chapter 3, verse 9. The show of their countenance does witness against them, and they declare their sin. As Sodom, it says, they hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. In many cases, we take pride in our sins today. We declare our sins. We spread filth right around the world, and because of technology, it spreads so fast. You know, back in 1933, this path that I talked about, Mr. Armstrong was walking everywhere, walking 3, 4, 5 miles to a public Bible lecture series, walking another 4 miles to the next schoolhouse, meeting with people, in some cases 18, 19 people. Started in the smallest of ways, but at the same time, it was a different time. We didn't have all the technology that we have today. Mr. Armstrong often talked about the paradox of our time. We've had these incredible modern advancements in technology, but look at where we're going as far as morality is concerned. As I say, it should be alarming. And if you're looking to the Bible, if you're looking at what Moses, said to the Israelites of old, that look, if you go down that road, if you try to cozy up to the world around you, if you start engaging in all of these sins, this idolatry, it's going to lead to curses. It's going to lead to captivity. And so you better be alarmed by it when you veer off course. Mr. Armstrong wrote this. This is not from the autobiography. If you don't have his autobiography, by the way, we'll happily send out a free copy of that in addition to the true history of God's true church. This is actually from a coworker letter back in 1967, where Mr. Armstrong said, God began intervening in world affairs. He's talking about the time period in 1933, 1934. He says, in the very smallest way at first, with this World Tomorrow broadcast and the Plain Truth magazine, it says this intervention is preparing the way for Christ's coming. Jesus Christ is about to return, and he tells us in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 what's to happen right before he gets back to this earth. And it's not good. I'll just give you some insight into those chapters. You go read it yourself. Open your Bible, see what it says. Prove all things. He says here, it is restoring the knowledge that sin is the transgression of God's law. And he cites 1 John 3 and verse 4, which I mentioned earlier. It is by a preaching of love, showing the people their sins. Here again, he's coming back to Isaiah 58, verse 1, obeying that commandment. It says here, it is making plain what sin is. It is lifting up its voice like a trumpet and is crying aloud with amplified power. It is fulfilling Isaiah 58 and verse 1. So he's talking about what started in 1933 and 1934 right here. This cradle of the Philadelphia era, the birthplace, the mother church, as Mr. Armstrong called it in that clip that I played for you. He says, finally, very soon now, God is going to intervene in world affairs just prior to Christ's coming by sending on the sinners of the world the plagues of the day of the Lord. I mean, that's not a popular message. Why would a lot of people get behind that kind of message and actually support it? Because Herbert Armstrong relied solely on God. He was obeying the command of Isaiah 58 and verse 1. He was trusting in God to provide for the work so that the message could spread. He says finally that, speaking of the day of the Lord, he says that is a time of God's wrath against evil spoken of in more than 30 different prophecies, both Old and New Testaments. Christ's coming is to occur as the climax of this day of the Lord. And so there is a good ending ultimately, because it results in the return of Jesus Christ to this earth and the establishment of God's kingdom on this earth with its headquarters, its earthly headquarters in Jerusalem. It's awesome. But what happens right before that? You've got the Great Tribulation and then the day of the Lord. You go back to the birthplace of the Philadelphia era of God's church. We're right here. This is where it all started. The World Tomorrow program that millions of people followed by the end of Herbert Armstrong's ministry. First, it started in October of 1933 with a free offer. Mr. Armstrong went on radio for just 15 minutes every Sunday morning, and the station manager was kind of shocked that there was so much response to it. And so they offered Mr. Armstrong a weekly program for 30 minutes. I think it was $2 or $2.50 a week, and they didn't even have the money for that. But Mr. Armstrong took it in faith. And then the month after that started, then you have the Plain Truth magazine that Mr. Armstrong printed off in the Fisher farmhouse, just a few miles ahead of me as well. Pretty amazing history. The first Plain Truth produced right here. The first radio broadcast produced right here. The first member of the Worldwide Church of God, as Mr. Armstrong describes in the autobiography, She came out of the Fisher farmhouse, Margaret Fisher, the first member, the first congregations right here around this area. The first plain truth. Pretty amazing. It's also amazing when you just step back and look at what has happened since. I mean, we know about the miraculous growth of the work during the ministry of Mr. Armstrong, but now, I mean, so much of the country has descended into this immoral abyss, as I said. But even when you know the history of the sixth era of God's church and what happened after Mr. Armstrong died, and just how Satan the devil went after that church to blot out that history. I mean, in this case, literally, there's a reservoir that they built here in 1942, just a few years after, you know, this cradle was thriving and growing and doors were opening. And then there's this reservoir that just kind of swamps this whole area. The Fear Butte School is torn down and basically is underwater since that time. There's only a little bit of the Gene Schoolhouse left. I mean, even the individual that worked so hard to destroy the work after Mr. Armstrong's death, he said he had a Christian duty to keep Mystery of the Ages, Mr. Armstrong's final book, a Christian duty to keep it out of print. He moved here just a few miles away 2-3 years ago. The history, so many people have tried to bury it. That's because the devil hates it. He hates the small beginnings. He hates the fact that God's truth, that God's church, the sixth era of God's church, started right here in this location. For more on the true history of God's true church, make sure that you call our operators today and request that book by my father, The True History of God's True Church. And I also mentioned the autobiography earlier. If you don't have a copy of that book, we'd be happy to send that out to you as well. You can get to our website, thetrumpet.com, for all of our literature online. And of course, if you'd like to follow some of the other videos that we produce, we've got the Key of David television program, we've got the Life and Teachings television program, and then we've got the Trumpet Daily program that we have at our website, thetrumpet.com. We thank you for joining us on today's show, and we hope to see you again next time.
All our literature is available free of charge at no cost or obligation to you. To request the free literature on today's program, visit www.keyofdavid.com.